When I was 9 years old, the river came within 1 inch of flooding my bedroom. Up to 50-foot trees were floating down the canyon, and my dad had to cross a flooded creek on a fallen log just to reach our home. But the most surprising part of that storm was what it took away when the water finally went down. It was 1993, and for days it had been raining. Not the occasional desert rain that comes and goes with the seasons, but a steady, relentless downpour that never seemed to stop. Right outside my bedroom window ran a small river. Most of the time it was a gentle flow, the kind of quiet sound that fades into the background of everyday life. But during that storm, it changed. That little river became a monster. The peaceful trickle turned into a roaring torrent that echoed through the canyon. At night, I could hear it from my bed, louder than the wind, louder than the rain, so loud that it was hard to sleep. To a 9-year-old, it felt powerful enough to threaten my very existence. At first, the adults didn't seem worried, until suddenly, they were. All across the region, rivers and creeks were swelling beyond their banks. I remember my parents telling us kids to pack our bags for the week. If the water kept rising, we wouldn't be able to make it home. We would stay at my grandparents' house in town. To reach our home, we had to drive through a small creek crossing. There was no bridge. And if the rain kept falling, that crossing would become too dangerous to drive through. I had already heard the story from years before I was born, about the time my dad nearly lost his brand new Toyota truck trying to cross that same creek during a flood. He got about 2/3 of the way through the crossing when water started coming into the cab and the truck stalled. He climbed onto the roof and jumped ashore. He ran home as fast as he had ever run, woke my mom and said, "Honey, if we hurry, we can save the truck." They grabbed chains, rushed back in my mom's old Bronco, and managed to pull the truck out before it was swept downstream. My dad wasn't going to take that risk again. The whole situation felt strange to me as a kid. It was exciting, but also terrifying. Something big was happening. I wanted to stay home and watch the rising water, but my parents insisted we go to school as usual. From the classroom window, I watched the rain pouring down outside. The creek running through our town had become a wild, muddy torrent. What was normally an orderly little downtown suddenly had the raw force of nature rushing right through it. The wilderness had arrived in the middle of our small city. That afternoon, we stayed at my grandparents' house, waiting for news. Eventually, my dad called. We couldn't go home, but we had animals that needed to be fed and cared for. So he said he was going to try to find a way back after work. That evening, we sat down to a worried dinner. Then the phone rang. It was my dad. He had found a way across. He was home. He couldn't drive across the flooded creek. The current would have swept his truck away. Instead, he parked miles away and walked in from the north. He knew the way, though he wasn't sure how he would cross the flooding creek. But as luck would have it, he found a fallen pine tree that had become a slick makeshift bridge. Carefully, he crossed the log, then continued on foot through the storm until he finally reached our house. When he got there, the river was the highest he had ever seen it. Up to 50-foot long trees were floating down the canyon in the floodwaters. The river had risen all the way to the steps of our front door. It came within 1 inch of flooding my bedroom. Our animals were frightened, but alive. The canyon itself had disappeared beneath a violent flood of brown water, churning with logs, trees, rocks, and debris. When school finally ended for the week, the rest of us followed the same route my dad had taken. We found the fallen log. One by one, we carefully crossed that slippery natural bridge. and finally made our way back to the place that mattered most to us, home. But as the storm passed and the waters slowly receded, we realized something. Nothing was the same. Our donkey pen fence had acted like a giant net during the flood, catching everything that tried to wash downstream. Logs, branches, rocks, trash. Our entire yard was buried under 3 feet of debris. But what hit me the hardest wasn't the mess. It was the missing trees. Cottonwoods, ash, willows, ponderosas, box elders. Trees I had known my entire life were suddenly gone. Some had fallen near where they once stood. Others had vanished without a trace. As a kid, it felt like losing members of my family. If you grew up close to a place like that, you probably understand what I mean. I was devastated. Eventually, we cleared the debris from the yard. My dad rethought how the river moved through our land and decided to build a rock wall along the riverbank to slow the erosion. When he finished that wall, he built another one just in front of it. And today, more than 30 years later, those walls still stand. They've endured many floods since then, though none quite as severe as the one in '93. But even now, I still think about the creek as it used to be, and the many big trees we lost, especially the cottonwoods, the towering giants that formed the cathedral of my childhood. These days, when I visit my happy place in my mind, I'm standing upstream at my favorite bend in the creek, and those old giant trees are still there with me. That storm was the first time I learned something I've never forgotten. The things we love, the things we believe will last forever, can vanish in a moment and live on only in the memories of what once was.